The story The Last Lesson by Alphonse Daudet is set in the days of Franco-Prussian War. The French districts of Alsace and Lorraine were captured by Germans. The new master, who was supposed to teach German in place of French, was supposed to come the next day. The story tells the effect of this news on the life at a school in Alsace. The story is based on the theme of linguistic chauvinism. Chauvinism is a devotion for or against something just based on what you feel, not necessarily what you may know. So linguistic chauvinism is the idea that one's language is superior to that of the others. Language is considered to be the cultural identity of a particular group of people who use it. The language of a country is the pride of that country. It not only defines the culture, but also tells us about the people, literature, and history of the country. The last lesson very prominently raises the question of linguistic and cultural hegemony of the colonial and imperial powers and their lust for controlling the world and influencing their cultures and identities. The second theme is human tendency to postpone learning. The story highlights the point that people realize the importance of their mother tongue only when they are refrained from using it. The last lesson very prominently raises the question of linguistic and cultural hegemony of the colonial and imperial powers and their lust for controlling the world and influencing their cultures and identities. People of Alsace and Lorraine are the victims of linguistic chauvinism. They are forced to learn German. The last lesson beautifully brings out the human tendency to postpone the learning of things, feeling that there is plenty of time to do so and they take it for granted. It is only once that we are refrained from using it, we realize how important it is for us. We tend to take our language for identity as a citizen of a particular country. The next theme is cultural erasure. The Prussian leadership's decree that German will be taught in place of French is an attempt at cultural erasure. The Prussians believe that they are more likely to unfold the formerly French region into the German Empire if they replace the local Francophone culture with German-speaking culture and curtail French language instruction. By steadily erasing French culture in the region, the Prussians hope to make the people of Alsace and Lorraine German in their identity, as they are much less likely to form alliance with French authorities if they no longer conceive of themselves as French. In the face of institutionally mandated cultural erasure, Hamel instructs his people to hold fast to their language and history, as he knows the only way to maintain their cultural identity is to never relinquish their language or national pride. One of the themes is regret. Regret touches every character in the story. For Franz, regret arrives in the form of an internal monologue about how he wishes he had spent more time dedicating himself to learning instead of skipping school to play in nature. Similarly, Hamel regrets that he didn't put more thought into how he could have engaged students like Franz, whom he often sent to water the garden instead of sitting in class. Hamel also regrets that he prioritized his desire to go fishing over his students' education, taking vacations and cancelling school whenever he pleased. Regret is also present in the village people who sit in on Hamel's last lesson, particularly in Erasure, who has tears in his eyes as he reads along with the younger students as they recite rudimentary grammar lessons. Erasure, like Franz and Hamel, regrets not having understood the true value of learning French before it became too late. They only appreciate what they have when it is gone. Talking about the characters, the first and the most important character is Monsieur Hamel or M. Hamel. He is a sincere French teacher who knows the subject well. He is passionate about French and considers French as the most clearest, most beautiful and logical language. He feels that language is a key to a person's sense of freedom and advises to hold on to French. He is proud of being French. Although he is upset by the occupation of Alsace by Germans, he is very much attached to his town, school and people. He is a hard taskmaster, particularly about discipline and learning. He is sensitive, honest. He blames himself for being selfish. He is also emotional because when the sound of Prussian soldiers is played, he really regrets. The next character is a school-going boy, Franz. He is sensitive, honest. He blames himself for ignoring his lessons. He understands the feelings of his teacher. He loves outdoors, sunshine, birds, butterflies. He is fond of collecting birds' eggs. As a student, he repents. He is a good observer. He notices changes. He empathizes with his teacher M. Hamel. He understands the teacher's emotions and accepts him with faults. Among the minor characters is Old Hauser, who is an elderly villager. Franz is surprised to see Hauser sitting on the back benches in the schoolroom alongside several other adults from the village. By the end of the story, Hauser is in tears as he reads from a rudimentary language textbook and speaks simple syllables and letters aloud with the young students. The second minor character is Watcher, the blacksmith. He teases Franz for hurrying so fast to school as he has read the town hall bulletin and knows Franz will have an unconventional day at school. The story opens with the introduction of Franz as a lazy boy. That morning, the narrator was late for school and was expecting insult from his teacher, M. Hamel. He had resisted the urge to skip the classes and went straight to the school. While passing the bulletin board, the blacksmith watcher addressed the narrator and told him not to hurry. He thought that the blacksmith was making fun of him. Usually the school started with a lot of noise and chaos, but that day it was all quiet. The quietness made it difficult for the narrator to sneak into the class. M. Hamel told the narrator in a kind manner to sit in the class. The second event hints at something which is wrong. The narrator made some observations in his mind and concluded that something was unusual that day. His teacher was dressed very differently. Moreover, the benches on the back were occupied by some elder men like Old Hauser, the former mayor, and many more. M. Hamel told the class that an order had come from Berlin that morning to teach only the German language in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine. Their new master would come the next day and M. Hamel would deliver his last French lecture that day. The narrator was dumbstruck. He suddenly started to love M. Hamel, his books and his whole class. The next event says that Prussians had captured Alsace and Lorraine. The narrator by now had understood as to why those older men were sitting there. They were there to attend their last lectures from their teacher too, and as a token of respect for their country that was not theirs anymore. The Prussians had captured the districts of Alsace and Lorraine that belonged to France. These orders came from the Prussian government. The next event says that Prussians had captured Alsace and Lorraine. The narrator by now had understood as to why those older men were sitting there. They were there to attend their last lectures from their teacher too. The next event explains that French is the most logical and beautiful language. Hamel asked the narrator, little Franz, to recite the rules of prepositions. However, he was unable to say anything. The teacher decided not to scold him. He told him that since he did not know French, those Germans would taunt him. Hamel blamed Franz's parents for not encouraging their kid to learn his language. He blamed himself for not teaching him with full enthusiasm. According to Hamel, the French language was the most beautiful globally, and it was very unfortunate that his students could not even read or write it. Then Hamel taught them a French lesson, and Franz seemed to understand it eloquently. Suddenly he realized that he had never paid attention to the French language earlier. Towards the end of the story, Hamel gave his students new notebooks with Franz, Alsace, France, Alsace written all over them. Pigeons scored very low that day, and little Franz thought if the Germans would make the pigeons also sing in German as well. Hamel sat restlessly on his chair, watching everything with great attention. His sister was packing everything as they had to leave the country the next day. Old Hauser also cried. It was 12, and the Germans came with their trumpets blowing loud. Hamel became pale and could not talk. He wrote, "We will love France" on the blackboard and made a hand gesture to say, "School is dismissed, you may go." In the story, the bulletin board is used as a symbol. The bulletin board outside the town hall in Franz's village is a symbol of Prussian power over the French region of Alsace and Lorraine. Normally used for communicating events and information vital to the townspeople, the occupying Prussian military co-opts the bulletin board as a channel for official decrees from Berlin. Franz became inured to the periodic arrival of yet more bad news communicated through the bulletin board, such that he loses interest in what the actual content is and hurries past the board on his way to school. By showing Franz's resigned reaction to the bulletin board, the writer illustrates how the people of France region are forced to assimilate their new reality, living under the control of a foreign power. The next symbol used is the garden. The garden Hamel cultivates outside the schoolroom is a symbol of time he has served as a teacher. During the lesson, Franz observes his teacher calmly taking in every detail of the classroom and the view out of the window. Franz imagines how heartbreaking it must be for Hamel to be forced by the Prussians to give up the space in which he had lived and taught for past 40 years. Franz comments that the only thing that has changed in time is the wearing out of the benches, the walnut trees Hamel planted growing taller in the garden, and the hoop vines twisting around the window frames. In this way, the garden functions as a visual symbol of Hamel's time spent as a teacher. The last French lesson also acts as a symbol. Hamel's commitment to continue teaching his French language lessons, despite the futility of knowing it, will be his last day of teaching, renders the lesson into a symbol of power of language. Hamel's pride as a teacher is evident when he advises his students and the assembled village people to never relinquish their native language, which he believes is a tool to battle ignorance and overcome oppression. On the eve of their language and culture being erased by the occupancy of Prussian forces, Hamel humbly and nobly performs the role he has always performed, hoping to instill in his students the same sense of duty to the language they have always taken for granted. The story is made even more beautiful by the use of a metaphor, what a thunderclap. After Hamel announces to the class that the French language will no longer be taught in Alsace and Lorraine, Franz comments on the shock of receiving the news, calling Hamel's words a thunderclap. With this metaphor, the narrator emphasizes the suddenness of the announcement by equating it with the loud, disrupting sound of thunder. Use of the simile looked like little flags make the story even more beautiful. During the cursive lesson, Franz comments on the slips of paper that contain Alsace and France, which Hamel distributes for the students to copy, look like little flags floating everywhere in the schoolroom, hung from the rod at the top of our desks. In this simile, Franz sees the common sight of cursive copy slips anew, under the circumstances of his native language being removed from his lessons. Franz interprets the slips as flags planted in the territory of the student's desk. Hamel would like to remind his students that the desk belonged to Alsace-Lorraine and not the Prussian invaders. The story experiences the use of another simile as if they had the key to their prison. Before beginning the grammar lesson, Hamel digresses to remind his students about the importance of learning and protecting their native language. With their language and culture under imminent threat from the invading Prussians, Hamel instructs his students to guard the French language, because when people are enslaved, as long as they hold fast to their language, it is as if they have the key to their prison. In this passage, writer uses simile to liken knowledge of one's native language to a key that lets them escape the prison, that is, the forces seeking to oppress and control them. The story experiences the use of irony in the form of unnecessary fear. The story begins with Franz dreading school because he is running late and has not prepared for the grammar lesson on participles. His unease even tempts him to skip school, but in an instance of situational irony, Hamel doesn't scold Franz under the sober circumstances of this being Hamel's last French lesson. Franz's concern turns out to be misplaced given the significance of the life-changing impositions of the Prussian occupying forces. Books become old friends is also used in the form of irony. Although Franz spends most of his time at school skipping class and putting off learning, his burdensome French textbook come to seem like old friends after he learns that he will no longer have the opportunity to learn his native language and history. In this instance of situational irony, Franz's resentment towards school suddenly transforms into a profound appreciation for the now forbidden acquisition of knowledge. There is also a use of visual imagery in the form of benches worn smooth. During the cursive lesson, Franz reflects on how life has changed in the schoolroom Hamel has spent last 40 years teaching in. The writer writes, only the desks and benches had been worn smooth. The walnut trees in the garden were taller, and the hoop vine had planted himself, twined about the windows to the roof. In this example of visual imagery, writer conveys the passage of time by detailing the incremental growth and wearing of the objects that fill out the setting. You can also find the use of auditory imagery in the form of pens scratching. Given the exceptional and mournful circumstances of their final French lessons, Franz and other students focus on their work like never before. During the writing lesson, Franz comments that you ought to have seen how everyone set to work and how quiet it was. The only sound was the scratching of pens over the paper. In this example of auditory imagery, writer conveys the silence of the room by emphasizing the quiet and precise sound of the students' pens on paper. The story is in first-person narration by Franz, a French schoolboy. The story is set in Alsace-Lorraine region of France during Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The tone is anxious and reflective, the mood is sober and proud. The protagonist is Franz, the antagonists include his teacher Mr. Hamel and the Prussian occupying forces. The major conflict in the story is that Franz's French teacher had been ordered to stop teaching French after the Prussian leaders ordered people in the occupied French territory to learn only German. Franz regrets not having put effort into his studies while he had the chance. The story reaches its climax when Hamel concludes the lesson by writing "We will love France" on the chalkboard and sends the class away.